Hello and welcome to India's World. The already frayed relations between Russia and the United States have plummeted further. Washington has decided to suspend diplomatic contacts with Moscow over failed efforts to end the civil war in Syria. And Moscow has put on hold a deal with the US on disposing weapons-grade plutonium. Russia has also suspended a 3-year-old agreement with the US on cooperation on nuclear energy research, further underscoring how bad things have become between the two countries. Much of the tension between the two countries has centered around the Syrian offensive against the rebel-held Aleppo, the country's largest city. The bombardment of civilian areas of the city, sometimes allegedly by Russian planes, has turned the city into a killing zone. Meanwhile, Russia has claimed that US spy planes are being spotted ever more frequently in the eastern Mediterranean and the Black Sea over Russian bases in Syria. In response, Russia has deployed SA-23 Gladiator anti-missile and anti-aircraft system in Syria, the first ever such deployment outside Russia. Western analysts see this as a preemptive step to counter any possible American cruise missile attack in Syria. It would seem that the Russia-US relations are unlikely to improve anytime soon. To discuss how things came to such a sorry pass, after encouraging signs of cooperation between the two countries in Syria, we have with us a very distinguished panel of experts. We have with us Ambassador Prabhat Shukla, a distinguished diplomat. He was Ambassador of India to Russia. Before that, he was the High Commissioner of India to Australia and to Singapore. He is a distinguished fellow at the Vivekananda International Foundation, a think tank in New Delhi currently. Professor Chintamani Mahapatra, one of our foremost specialists on American foreign policy, is Professor of American Studies at the School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. And we are lucky to have with us Dr. Waiel Awwad. He is a Syrian journalist based in India. He is the South Asia Bureau Chief of the Syrian Arab news agency, SANA. I welcome you, gentlemen, to this discussion. Mr. Shukla, let me begin with you. Do you think that the already existing chill in ties between the US and Russia in the aftermath of Crimea and Ukraine has been accentuated further by the developments in Syria?
Oh, I think the evidence is inescapable. Yes, things have got worse. And I was reading the other day that there's been some fairly strong military statements from both sides. The chief of the American army has been saying that they can destroy any enemy that comes against them, and the Russians have warned them against any military action against either themselves or against the Syrians. So yes, I think things are rather dangerous, and they haven't, I think, got the attention that they deserve. And I think the problems actually go back to more than just the last round of tensions that we are witnessing over Aleppo. This has been a running sore, and I think in my reading of the situation, the turning point was when the Iran nuclear deal was signed, and with that the Iranian position began to shift with all its internal divisions, because there are very serious internal divisions in Iran as well. But with that, I think an entirely new strategy had to be worked out, and we could see how, for instance, Assad went to Moscow for the first time since the uprising began. Putin went to Tehran, which he has not done for a long, long time. So there is a whole lot of activity that has begun since July 2015. And we are seeing now the culmination of this because of initially of the bombing of Deir ez-Zor, and then the riposte from whichever side, we are not still very sure which side, probably Russians, in Aleppo, and the aid convoy that was coming in from Turkey.
Okay. Professor Mahapatra, would you agree with those who say that Russia is using the last days of the Obama administration to strengthen President Bashar al-Assad and his hold on power, help him expand his territory, consolidate his hold over Syria, and constrain the efforts or the possible policy of the new administration, which would take over only on January 20th next year?
I don't agree with that at all. I think Syria is a very important strategic ally of the former Soviet Union and now Russia for a long time. For the last 5 years, consistently Russia is supporting the Assad regime. And I see in whatever is happening in the battlefield of Syria, all kinds of indications of a very serious new Cold War emerging, between USA and Russia. Many people ticked up Russia as a power. Now Russia is back with a bang. Whether you think about Georgia or Ukraine or Crimea or the way they're asserting in the Middle East now and consistently supporting the Assad regime, is very clear that Russia is back on the rail and a new kind of Cold War is emerging in that part of the world.
Okay, we're going to discuss that further. Dr. Awwad, do you think that turning point in Syria was really the air attack, as Ambassador Prabhat Shukla pointed out, by US and its allies at a Syrian army base in Deir ez-Zor, lasting an hour, killing 62 Russian troops? Now, the US explanation was that this was an accident that happened, but this accident lasted 1 hour. And what is also curious, the Russians point out, is that within 1 hour of the attack, a ground offensive was launched by Al-Qaeda extremists.
No. Actually, this is the problem. Whenever the coalition forces does attack intentionally, they call it a mistake. If there are 4 countries participated in the attack for more than an hour, and we have already news of the communication between Daesh on the ground and the American pilot, that the moment they finished the bombing, that Daesh moved into the position of the Syrian army. It's unlikely to be an accidental, because America knows their intention in the region, Bharat. The intention of the United States in Syria is balkanization of Syria, and that's what they have done in Yugoslavia, they have done in Iraq, and they are doing it. They did in Libya, and the Russian told them very clearly that we will not let you repeat the same, taking us for a ride in Syria.
Okay.
And there was a news of that the last days of the American administration, there was a plan. And in fact, these are the intelligence from Berlin and from Moscow have revealed just last week that the Americans are preparing 800 Air Force NATOs to attack all the Syrian position all over Syria and allow the militants in the ground to take on.
Okay, let me take that question to Ambassador Shukla. You had mentioned what American generals are saying. There are also other American strategic experts who believe that the Syrian government forces could be degraded through cruise missile attacks, and hence the missile defense system the Russians have put there, that this would alter the military balance on the ground in favor of the rebel groups. Call it the Free Syrian Army, call it extremists, call them Al-Nusra, whoever you want, because distinguishing between them is becoming increasingly difficult. Now, what is the likelihood of Obama ordering a military strike in Syria in the last days of his presidency?
Look, let's step back a little bit, okay? I think, yes, there are very powerful factors pushing for a confrontation, and I would put it to you that there are divisions even within the American and Russian systems. It's quite clear to me that the Pentagon, for example, is very unhappy with the diplomacy which John Kerry is carrying out with Obama's backing. Equally, it seems to me that in Russia there are differences, and I think it's important for us to focus. We don't really pay attention to what goes on inside Russia anymore, but Putin has changed some very critical elements in his own team. He has changed his own chief of staff, the long-serving Sergei Ivanov. He has changed the head of his external intelligence, and he has changed his, he brought in Sergei Kirienko as his number 2 in the presidential administration. The way I am reading it is these are all signals to the Americans that he is not interested in an escalation. All of them would be signaling, and I believe it is being so read by the Americans, that this is a signal of a willingness to reach an understanding. Now, I think the fact that Deir ez-Zor was attacked, fully well knowing that it was a Syrian army, clearly indicates, and in fact the Pentagon spokespeople said it openly. Similarly, it's very curious. The FSA attacks Jarablus across the Turkish frontier, and they were heading towards Manbij, which is being held by the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is basically Kurdish. And it's the Pentagon that steps in and says, no, don't tangle with the Kurds in Manbij. So you can see, it's not a two-way split. Okay. There are many players in this, and it's, for me, at least at the moment, it's very hard to say where this is heading, what the outcome will be.
Okay,
but we'll come back to this.
Yeah. Okay, all right. We need to take a break at this point. We'll be back again in a bit. Stay with us. Don't go away. Welcome back. We're discussing the deterioration in Russia-US ties because of the Syrian conflict. Dr. Awwad, do you think the Russian goal is to help the Syrian military retake the besieged city of Aleppo? And how would the fall of Aleppo change diplomacy in Syria?
Well, it's very important to understand one thing, Bharat. The Syrian Aleppo has been the second largest populated city of Syria. And for the last 5 years, it's under siege from different parts of rebels and terrorists al-Nusra, which has been actively in that Syria. And I can tell you, eyewitnesses, that people for the last 3 years were not able to have a salat plate. They just store wheat, because only wheat you can make the bread, and the rest of it gets spoiled. Because no electricity, no power supply. None of the world raised an eyebrow about the suffering of Aleppo. Only when the Syrian army started cutting the route of supply from Turkey, stopping al-Nusra, al-Qaeda from gaining ground, and then there is a cry. Syria is not Aleppo. There is lots of problem inside Syria. There are many things happening inside with the Israeli side, where they are supporting al-Nusra, that front. It's Jordan is also supporting. Northern part of Idlib, it's also there are forces.
But how would the fall of Aleppo
The fall of Aleppo is not the fall. It is the retaking of those positions in the eastern part of Aleppo, where there are people held hostage by the terrorist organization. Even de Mistura yesterday, he was saying he was ready to accompany. He admitted there are 8,000 al-Nusra al-Qaeda. Actually, the reason for the failure of the American-Russian truce is because American refused to reveal or to show, segregate between al-Nusra and the moderate groups, they call them, and the moderate terrorists. So that was the whole issue. So if the United Nations is putting all its forces, and the NATO are adamant to make sure that there is no emergence of a victory for the Syrian army and for the Russian in Syria, because that will give the Russian dominant in the Middle East. That's what the Americans are avoiding.
Okay. Professor Mahapatra, how would the US see the recapturing of Aleppo by the Syrian army with the help of the Russians? Would they lose face in Middle East, as Dr. Awwad is suggesting? And would they be seen as a power in retreat? What will be the US attitude to peace talks after Aleppo is recaptured by the Syrian army?
You know, certainly it is going to be a kind of loss of face for the United States of America. There are liberal hawks and the neocons belonging to the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, all are pushing for an all-out confrontation against what the Russians are doing in Syria. Now, there are sane people who are saying, now, right now the elections are going on. Election is going to take place in Russia next year. So, one group of people who are saying something that all of us should wish, they are saying, basically the American government and the Russian government are playing to their own local constituencies, and there is not going to be any big confrontation over it. But the fact remains that on the one side, today in the Russian newspapers, they talk about Third World War. And on the other side, the Obama administration is under pressure, do something about it, because the Russians are really asserting in a much bigger way than they should. My worry is this, just one line, my worry is this, the Syria is now facing intervention from both the powers. Now, it's a question of foreign intervention. Why not allow the local government to sort out its own problem? They're not doing it. It's becoming so complex that, again, I'll repeat my old statement. This is yet another confrontation, proxy war you call it, civil war you call it. It is Cold War.
Okay. Shukla, we'll discuss this in a bit, what he has said, but let me ask you this. Do you think before the outcome of the battle of in Aleppo, Moscow would agree to a ceasefire? Because there are all kinds of suggestions are coming, some of them absolutely ridiculous, for example, from the UN, saying that have a ceasefire and UN is willing to escort Al-Qaeda out of Aleppo. Why do these
with
people...
Their arms.
With their arms.
With
Why?
Their arms, yeah.
Why not let them die in Aleppo? I mean, why would the UN want to protect Al-Qaeda? So if Russia agrees to a ceasefire before Aleppo is captured, would it not allow Al-Qaeda to get reinforcements, regroup and consolidate itself?
No, look, I think we need to be clear about this. The notion that the rebels would be allowed to go out with their arms is actually in the 9th September agreement between Kerry and Lavrov. But this does not apply to the Jabhat al-Nusra, and it does not apply to Al-Qaeda.
Ah, yes.
So, if somebody is indeed making such a suggestion, I think it's a non-starter. The Russians will not agree. And look, the history of even the last 18 months is littered with broken agreements on ceasefires. one side or the other. There are so many weapons, there are so many groupings, and of course there are so many sovereign states, and there's the Hezbollah, there are Turks. We haven't even talked about the Turks. They have been playing a very negative role inside Syria. So any one of them could jump the gun and you have a ceasefire in tatters all over again.
Yeah, okay. Dr. Awwad, Professor Mahapatra suggested that this is the same old proxy war which is going on. But is it? Is it the same old proxy war where you know, while claiming to fight Islamic State, Russia is actually protecting old protege of theirs, Bashar al-Assad, and on the other hand, US and its allies are trying to topple him? Or do you think Russian interests, motivations in Syria are different? They go beyond Syria?
It is beyond Syria for sure. Syria may not be the flashpoint for a third world war between US and Russia. They will not fight over Syria for that. It's a matter of dominance in the region, who will have their influence, and how to divide this world into their own interest. In fact, if you look at the Syrian crisis, well, I don't know, the Americans themselves have stated that. You don't have to be a good researcher and scholar to know what's going on the ground. Look, Joe Biden said himself, we created Daesh with the help of Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Israel, because we wanted to defeat Assad. Even similar fashion, Hillary Clinton said it herself, and even Simon Hirsch, he's written in 2007.
But Trump is saying it all the time to Hillary Clinton.
It is a market-driven force, Bharat. It's an arm industry in Syria. It is the destruction of the country which is happening in Syria. And even the Americans said we cannot enter Syria because we are illegitimately supporting a terrorist organization. Even Kerry leaked intentionally to New York Times his story because they knew what they were preparing for. The Syrian government is a legitimate government selected by the people. It is for the Syrian government and the Russian to see that the implementation of a political dialogue in Syria. That's what we are looking for. So I don't see the Americans are going to fight over Syria. But look at the wider perspective.
Okay.
Let us put it in 2 minutes. It is the Silk Route. End of Silk Route is Syria. Think about it, of Russia and China together in the wider perspective, how to look at it in the global affairs.
All right. We will discuss this in a bit some more. We need to take a break at this point. Stay with us. Don't go away. Welcome back. We are discussing the deterioration in Russia-US ties over the conflict in Syria. Professor Mahapatra, is it possible that this is really a different kind of Cold War? This is not like the old Cold War, that not only does Russia want to be seen as an equal by the US in dealing with the Syrian crisis and not agree to every US plan of what they want to do with Syria, but it also wants to be seen as a state with global interests, a state whose interests are not limited to Georgia, Crimea, and Ukraine and former Soviet republics.
You know, Russia is an oil-producing country. Now the energy prices are crashing everywhere. That is affecting tremendously Russian economy also. Middle East is the real area where you have the oil, and the Americans are becoming energy dependent. So the Russians, they want to have certain amount of control in a region where the Americans have their own military and they're playing the real geopolitical game there. So that is why I'm looking at it in a bigger, colder kind of fashion. But if you link it up with Syria, my worry is it is not just US and Russia. Look at the Iranians are involved there, the militias from Iraq involved there, Lebanese Hezbollah involved there, Turks are involved there. Now in this complex game, ultimately the Syrian people are suffering.
Absolutely.
Right. So it is a bigger game than just Syria. Syria is the victim.
Yeah, no, that I agree. But let me ask you this, Ambassador Shukla. My point was really why are Russians engaged in this war? Not whether Syrians are suffering. No, of course they are suffering. It goes without saying. It also goes without saying that there are too many players there with their different agenda. We are on the Russian agenda. Now you suggested that the changes in Russian administration have been such that Americans should conclude from it that Russia does not want escalation. Now in that context, will America be willing to see Russia as a player with interests that are not inimical to that of America's, and that the interests may be different, but they also overlap when it comes to fighting the ISIS, fighting terrorism, fighting Islamic fundamentalism?
Okay, look, this is a very big question, but before we go forward, I just want to clear up one thing. The Russian elections are due in 2018, not next year. So Putin is not really maneuvering for any electoral benefits. There are very real substantive issues at stake. and we haven't even talked about them yet. And the issue really is gas supplies from Qatar and Iran to Europe. Russia's stake is in preventing that from happening. The American global strategy is to cement that linkage. Now, the Qataris have bowed out of the struggle and they have switched to LNG. So their LNG supplies today to Europe are not quite as large as Russian pipeline supplies, but close enough. Now, similarly, the Russians have no commitment to Assad. This is a mistake. If you read Resolution 2254 of December last year, there's a very clear hint that Assad is a highly dispensable commodity. Furthermore, the Russians have given an office for the Syrian Kurds in Moscow. They're the only European, they've asked for offices in other European countries. They've been declined so far. But the Russians have opened an office for them in Moscow. So they are preparing for the eventuality that Syria, like Iraq, might disintegrate. The game, in fact, now has shifted to Turkey. Turkey has its huge fault lines internally, and Erdogan is leading the country in a very strongly Islamic direction. This failed coup has given him a virtual free hand, but he's also edging closer to Russia. And Russia would be very happy to do another pipeline deal with the Turks. It's called the Turkish Stream. And with that, they will have blocked off Iran. And therefore, there are subterranean frictions between Iran and Russia. So the relationship is not as cozy as it once was. How will the Americans react to all this? I think a lot depends on who wins the election. Today's news suggests that Trump is in very bad trouble. But there's still a month to go, let us see. But I think if you have a Clinton administration, the tensions will continue. With Trump, it may get a little better.
Okay. While you wanted to say something.
I think there are two issues which is very important. You know, doing a military adventure in Syria will pop up the chances of Hillary Clinton to continue with the legacy of Obama on the region and the chaos and the wars. The second part, where the local regional allies of the United States are creating the havoc. You know, inside Syria, there are 22 intelligence, CIA, MI6, French, Mossad, name it, and they are in Syria. And even the other angle which I am trying to bring here is the terrorism and the fundamentalist, where Russia already having more than 12,000 Chechens and from the Caucasus region are in Syria. So the Russians have already warned that the same project which they have repeated in Afghanistan, Bharat, they repeated with IS, Daesh inside Syria. So this is already to create havoc all over the world. Any country who is having more than 2-digit mercenaries inside Syria are having trouble to think about it.
So you're basically saying ISIS is a far bigger challenge to Russia.
Yes.
Or if not as much of a challenge it is culturally and
absolutely, because you have 9 provinces of minorities. They are pushing them back there because Saudi Arabia.
So why doesn't
Qatar,
the West recognize that?
They are happy. As long as they were damaging the region, they were happy. But the moment they start firing back at them, they say, oh, it's too late, it's too late. It's unleashed. Now we have to bring them back.
Okay, last question. We are really running out of time. You know, I agree with Ambassador Prabhat Shukla where he says that Russians think that Assad is a dispensable commodity. So up to now, a lot of people have said that they're trying to protect Assad. You know, this fight against ISIS is utter nonsense. But could it be the other way around, that the Russians see tactically that unless Assad is in power, unless the Syrian state survives, you will not be able to fight against ISIS because then you're leaving the ground open for ISIS. So you can get rid of Assad, but first you have to get rid of ISIS.
You know, Assad is a pawn in my view. And this kind of commitment given to regimes fluctuate quite often. Imagine for how long the Americans supported the Egyptian strongman, and when the time came, they just dumped him. So Russia will protect its own interest, whoever may be in power. So Assad is dispensable, but if Assad is important, they will try to protect him. And things are becoming...
So we're going on, but last word to you. Is Assad important in the war against ISIS? Does the Syrian state need to survive to fight ISIS or not?
No, it does not need to survive because ISIL has actually spread far beyond just Syria. And another thing, the Russians have shown that ISIL is not much of a fighting force. When they bombed them from the air in Palmyra, they just shaved their beards, abandoned their weapons and ran. So, you know, this whole thing that they are 10 feet tall and there's nothing you can do with them, it's all nonsense. When they decide that they've got to be rolled up, they'll be rolled up in 6 months.
Yes.
Okay.
I think
Last
the more
slide.
you play on the ground of Syria, the more you have the cook, the more you will spoil the dish. Syrian people paying with their own blood what's happening inside Syria, and the Syrian people will decide the fate of their president, whom to elect. President
alright.
Assad has been selected by the Baath party, which is the major party there. He continued with the legacy of his father. So let the Syrian people decide. If they really want election, let the ballot decide.
All right. Okay.
Can I
We've
just make one
really
brief
run out of
point?
time. Okay. Quickly.
That is, you know, recently Assad said that he is going to retake all of Syria. The first people to contradict him were the Russians.
Okay. All right. We've really run out of time. Thank you very much, Dr. Waiel, Awwad, Professor Chintamani Mahapatra, Ambassador Prabhat Shukla, for participating in this discussion. That is all we have for you today. We'll be back again as usual next week with another topic, another subject, other experts. Until then, goodbye. Thanks for watching India's World. Meanwhile.